Welcome back to Management 2020. In this video, we'll talk about feedback. And specifically, we'll talk about the need for feedback, sources of feedback, types of feedback, and lastly, we'll finish off by talking about the mindset of feedback. So feedback, we should think of it as part of this conversation of our communication. And that when we talked about writing processes, we mentioned that the final step might be publishing and presenting. But in reality, it's not. That's not the end of this conversation that we have. Feedback is part of this, our growth as writers and presenters, and it's part of this constant communication where the things that we produce become part of this larger conversation with the people that we interact with our audience, with our coworkers, with our clients. So if we're not integrating feedback as part of our regular process, we're missing out on a big part of this conversation that we need to be having. So feedback can come in many different ways. One source of feedback, or one way to look at feedback, is indirect feedback versus direct feedback. Direct feedback is getting information from our audience directly, that they tell us or give us information or ask us questions about the texts that we produced, whether these are written texts or whether these are oral texts. So if we're getting the information from our audience directly, we call that direct feedback. But if we're hearing what someone else is relating about what our audience said about our feedback, then that's considered indirect feedback. And both can be valid, but direct feedback tends to usually get us more accurate information. So we should be looking for opportunities to solicit that direct feedback. Another way to think about feedback is whether it's internal or external. So within our organization or within our team, if we're getting feedback from our group, then we consider that internal feedback. And many people will seek out internal feedback before they publish or present something, so that they're getting feedback from peers and colleagues on how well something is presented, how well it is accepted. The reality, though, is that an internal audience is usually not the same as our intended audience. And so they can give us some feedback, but we don't always get a fully accurate representation of how our text will be received. And so then that takes us to external feedback. And external feedback is feedback without our organization, outside of our organization. What are people saying about the texts that we produce? So multiple sources of feedback can be helpful in getting a clearer and broader sense of how our texts are received by our audience. User-generated feedback has become much easier to collect and to analyze and to integrate into our writing and presentation processes, thanks primarily to the internet, this digitally connected world where if we're producing videos on our company's website or we have social media accounts, we can get user-generated feedback quite easily. And whether it's things like views or clicks or likes or comments written by our audience, these user-generated sources of feedback can give us a sense of how well our texts are received by the audience. So as we look at soliciting some user-generated feedback, there are some ways we can organize our efforts to get different types of feedback that can give us different types of information. And one of this is through doing interviews with members of our target audience. We might identify people that are good sources or representative of the kinds of audiences we're trying to reach, and then conducting an interview with them. And interviews often will start with a series of basic questions that we hope to, information we want to get from our audience, but most interviews are open enough and flexible enough that we can allow the interviewee to kind of co-guide the interview and maybe bring up topics that we hadn't considered within our prepared interview questions. When I worked in businesses, we would regularly schedule times to reach out to some of our key users so that we could find out how new versions of our software are working or how our in-person trainings were working and being received by the audience. So this is a great way to get feedback from your audience. We just want to make sure that we are targeting a broad range of users or clients or customers, and we're not just choosing those that are sure to give us positive feedback. Surveys can be another way. Surveys, like a questionnaire, might be delivered in person, but more likely, especially in our digitally connected world, we're conducting surveys through the internet. So we're providing maybe our customer base with a link, and then they can take a survey, whether it's through a tool like Google Surveys, Qualtrics, or other types of online surveys. Um, the difference usually between a survey and an interview is a survey asks more questions, but the questions are shorter and easier to answer. Survey questions are often close-ended, which means that we have provided a selection of options for the survey taker to choose. But usually surveys have fewer open-ended questions, where we invite the respondent to just share their thoughts and feelings. So survey data can be faster to collect, and we hope that we're sending it out to a wider group of people so we get a broader range. Interviews take longer to conduct. They're more in depth, and so we may not interview as many people as we would survey. Focus groups are kind of a form of interview in a sense, where you invite a group of people who are representative of maybe your customer or client base, and then you ask them a series of questions about your products or services. And the goal here is that we're kind of conducting an interview, but we're doing it with a broad range of people. So we're not just spending time on one perspective, we're getting multiple perspectives. Another advantage of focus groups is that we can help the respondents kind of build on one another's ideas. And so if someone were interviewed um, individually, they may not think about things that they care about just because it didn't spark, we didn't ask the right questions or make the right comments to sort of spark their memories or their opinions. But when they're in a focus group, the respondents can kind of build off of one another, and we can get a sense of whether or not there's consensus or disagreement. Sometimes there is a disadvantage to focus groups that if there is kind of a real dominator in the group that is very forceful in their opinions, they can kind of force that opinion on the whole group, even though there may not be consensus. So it's important to establish good guidelines for the focus group and to let the group know that it's okay if there isn't consensus among them on certain opinions. Another way that we can also gather user feedback is through usability testing and using a think aloud. Particularly if we're working with software, a website, or something where there's a process involved in using the product or service we require, we can invite users or potential users in to interact with our product so that we can see how are they interacting with it in the way we expected. We can invite them to do what's called the think aloud. And the think aloud is to voice aloud the thought processes and the actions that they're doing. So as they interact with the website, they may tell us what they're doing, why they're doing it, what they expect to happen when they click on links or when they expect to interact with the web page in a certain way. And so this can be a great way to get feedback on, do our intended audience members respond to our product in the way that we expected? And I've done this with software where we go in and we go to schools and we look at how teachers and students are using our products. Are they using it in the ways that we expect? And that can give us valuable feedback as we build maybe the next version or we work on updates and realize that what we anticipated to be the normal way of interacting with our materials might be very different from how users are doing it in actual situations. The textbook also talks about this idea of formally soliciting feedback by conducting research. And briefly, I want to talk about some of these research issues that can be helpful both if you are going to conduct research, but also just to understand and read research, particularly business research. And first thing is the difference between qualitative and quantitative data. Um, Qualitative data, it's got the word in there, quality, and this tends to be the types of data that is more verbal. meaning that it's coming from interviews or long responses to surveys where users can type out their responses and feelings. And usually when we analyze qualitative data, we're looking for common themes or common issues. And so the analysis of qualitative data is very different than the analysis of quantitative data. Quantitative data tends to be more number-based kind of data where we can make a score of something or a rating of something. And so lots of surveys tend to have many types of questions that are more quantitative. The advantage of collecting quantitative data, measuring how long someone does something or how much someone likes or dislikes or agrees or disagrees with something, is we can convert it to a number and then we can analyze it according to things like averages or standard deviations, how much the group is similar or different in their ratings or their measurements. We can also do other kinds of statistical analyses. And when we do that, that can allow us to do what we have listed here last on the list, which is a statistical significance. If we have the right kinds of data and enough of that data, we can measure to see differences between groups and find out, is those differences between groups just chance that they're slightly different, or is there it's highly unlikely that it's just chance that makes those groups different, and it's probably something about the nature of the two groups that means that one group performs differently than the other group. As we are collecting all this data, we want to be sure to think about whether our data is valid and reliable. Now, reliable data means that if we were to collect this data again and again from a similar group of people, that we would get similar kinds of results, so that it's on target in a sense, and that it is consistent in the way that the data is collected and reported. An example of maybe unreliable data is maybe some data where there's a problem with the measurement, right? There's a problem with our measurement tools. We measure it one day and we get one number. We measure the exact same thing the next day and it hasn't changed, but because of our measurement problems, we're getting a different number. That can be one way it happens, but it'd also be that maybe it's something that's very subjective. And it's really affected by people's moods. And so we interview someone to ask them about maybe our software or our product, and they respond one way one day because they're in a good mood, and the next day they're in a bad mood, and they respond very differently the next day. And so our data tool and the kinds of questions we are answering just aren't reliable enough, and we may want to look at ways of trying to make our data more reliable. Validity comes in with the idea, does what we think we're measuring actually measure the thing we think we're measuring? And sometimes this can happen when we think we're measuring one thing, like maybe how effective our product is, but in reality, we're maybe measuring someone's happiness level. And so we're not getting the right kind of data because we're asking maybe the wrong kinds of questions, or the way that we're gathering the data just isn't valid enough to make sure that the information we're getting matches what we think that we are measuring. So these are all things that researchers need to consider so that when they're getting feedback, that feedback is useful, they're analyzing it appropriately, they're reporting it appropriately, and then they're using that feedback in meaningful ways to enhance their conversation, to enhance the text that they produce and the messages that they share with their audience. Lastly, let's talk about this mindset feedback. A lot of people, and this is normal, feel very personally tied to the works that they produce, whether it's presentations or written documents. And a part of them goes into creating these messages. And so they can feel very closely tied, and their personal worth sometimes can be very closely tied to the messages they produce. And so it can be very hard when that message is not well received or is not received in the way that they intended. If their message is criticized or attacked, they can feel like they personally are criticized or attacked. And so this is an important part as we develop as good business communicators, is to have a healthy distance between our personal identity and worth and our messages. And that, yes, we want to continually produce better and better messages that are more effective. But when a message is not effective, it doesn't mean that we're not a good person. Um, and this brings us to the concept of growth mindset and a fixed mindset. And researchers have shown that sometimes we can tend to have more of a fixed mindset in some ways versus a growth mindset. A fixed mindset is a mindset that believes that things are just the way they are. We have a certain just sort of limit of talent in certain areas, and that's just an innate part of who we are. It doesn't change. We either have those skills or we don't have those skills. And fixed mindsets can be really dangerous because they can cause us to think that we can't change or improve. When we fail, then it's because there's something fundamentally wrong with us and there's nothing we can do about that. Whereas a growth mindset suggests that almost every trait we have has some ability for development and growth. And so if we will put in the effort, we can improve on the things that we are weak in. Having a growth mindset is better for taking feedback and criticism because if maybe something we produced doesn't function very well, we don't have to take it personally. We don't have to feel like we are a failure, but we can say, okay, parts of this did not work well. And now I can plan to do better the next time I create a similar message. I can develop the skills, I can learn from my mistakes, and I can be better. So I just want us to remember that we need to, as good business communicators, develop a growth mindset, especially in our ability to use language, our ability to interact with people, and our ability to develop those kinds of skills. As we get feedback from others, there's a wide range of categories of that feedback, and understanding what kinds of categories of feedback we're getting can help us sort of interpret that feedback, but it can also help us when we're asked to give feedback. And are we giving the kind of feedback that our audience wants? So the first one is evaluative. Evaluative feedback is probably the most common source of feedback, and it's basically judgment, right? Is this good or is this bad? And this is where the growth mindset is really helpful to have because if we get evaluative feedback that says bad, we just need to realize, okay, maybe there were some parts of it that are bad. Let's identify those and let's fix those. Instead of having a fixed mindset, we get feedback that something's bad and we just think, well, I might as well just give up. I've chosen the wrong profession. And the same problem can be even with positive feedback with a fixed mindset. There's just a sense of I don't need to fix anything because everyone liked my message. I don't need to improve or learn anymore. And of course, no matter what skill set we have, there's always room for improvement. Interpretive feedback usually has more to do with clarifying. So you get feedback that says, can you explain that again, or can you clarify this? So interpretive feedback is helping us understand whether our message is being received clearly or not. So it's not so much do they like the message or not, it's are they understanding our message? Supportive feedback is feedback that just is encouraging, that just lets us know, hey, we're doing a good job, we're making a difference, we're improving. Probing feedback is feedback that lets us know that people want to know more about the topic. So they're asking follow-up questions. They want us to go deeper and into more detail. And lastly, understanding is more empathetic feedback, right? Letting us know that we relate to the audience, that letting us know that they understand us, that they appreciate us, that they can sympathize with us. And so as we are receiving feedback, sometimes it's helpful to understand what kind of feedback we're getting, and then to understand how we can use that feedback to maybe encourage us, to help us clarify our messages, to help us give more information and follow up on those messages, or whether there's aspects of our message that we need to improve. So the goal of this video overall was to help us understand that as good writers and presenters, we need to be open to feedback and understanding maybe what kinds of feedback we're getting, how to use that feedback, and how we can solicit specific kinds of feedback to help us improve our products, our services, and our messages.